Take it there, who gon' take it there, who gon' take it there, who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air. It's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility.
So something that I caught wind of recently, it went viral a couple days ago. Pete Buttigieg appeared on Andrew Schulz's podcast and did a pretty good job explaining some pretty middle liberal ideas to him in a way that, I don't know, Andrew Schulz and people like him seem to just be allergic to at this time because their head is full of a bunch of shit about how Republicans are cooler. Andrew Schulz also just had a clip going around the other day about how the reason he voted for Trump is because like Republicans are the ones who get pussy now in his mind. And it used to be Democrats like Bill Clinton getting pussy. And now, we got Trump and the Republicans are like the cool ones who are saying, say whatever you want, blah, blah, blah. So that's, how his mind works about these issues. No consideration for, the farcical use of free speech as an election issue, only to turn around and jail and deport people for their free speech. Or the people who get repressed because of administrations like Trump's. Not only his administration, but certainly we're starting to see the reality of that now, I think. And, for guys like Schulz, it's more about, are you appealing to my manhood? Do you make me feel manly? Do I feel like a man in this sort of media environment that you are creating for me? And that's mostly what it's about, it seems like. And so a conversation with him and Pete is interesting because Pete is a great communicator and comes across pretty naturally, pretty conversationally in these contexts. But he's also he doesn't fit the traditional mold of masculinity, but I think he also still comes off very well when he's sort of up against that backdrop. And Fox News was making fun of this a little bit and saying, oh, Pete Buttigieg isn't the one that I would send out to, hang out with the bros. And that's because it makes them nervous that people like Andrew Schulz and the audience of Andrew Schulz might listen to somebody like Pete Buttigieg, listen to a communication style that is not based in these gender roles that are meant to blind you from any real political realities. And so it is an interesting moment to see Pete Buttigieg cutting through some of that bullshit. I think that's part of his intention here. I also think that he's probably gearing up a run for president, or, Pete has learned more than anybody that if you just throw yourself out there, make yourself available, say, I want to be president because here's my resume, and you make the run, whatever, you'll probably get picked up for something. So he's, regardless of whether he really thinks he wants to be president or whether he's going to try to beat J.D. Vance or Trump in 2028, I think is beside the point. It's more that he wants to be out there. He wants to be in all of our faces. And so that's where, to address the elephant in the room, I am not a huge fan of Pete Buttigieg. I would prefer him not to be in all of our faces all the time. I don't necessarily view him as somebody that I am on the same team as, but it's interesting. I had the interesting feeling while watching this of I don't really feel like Pete Buttigieg stands up for the things that I would stand up for and would want a public official to stand up for. But he's also communicating these things that need to be communicated very well. And there is some overlap, maybe not in terms of things I agree with him 100% on, but things that definitely need to be communicated to a guy like Andrew Schulz. So that's mostly what this conversation was, but I think also Buttigieg showed his weak spots, at least in my perspective, maybe because he was having this conversation, so he leaned into certain things more, like being capitalism friendly. even though, Buttigieg is no stranger to that. He's a product of the sort of neoliberal order, and so all of his ideas are going to fit neatly into that paradigm. So that's really the reason that if you're somebody out there who likes Pete Buttigieg, you find him likable and thoughtful and well-spoken, and you wonder why people don't like him, the reason is because he represents a system of fusion between government and capitalism that has really fueled a lot of the middle class and lower class getting screwed. And, that attaching of profit motive to solving problems that government should be solving, it's part of the reason so many fundamental things have eroded. And if you're not going to say Pete Buttigieg is the type of person who's directly responsible for that, he's at least, he's around for it, right? He was in the administration leading up to this Trump administration. It seems pretty clear that Buttigieg was doing a better job as transportation secretary, but at the same time, we didn't see, I guess, it's hard to hold him accountable specifically for that because that was Biden's administration. Biden is the one who's responsible for the fact that his administration didn't change anything sufficiently enough to prevent what Trump is now doing. That was kind of the whole point of electing Joe Biden, is do something to fortify this government, this democracy that we have against the attacks that we now know it's vulnerable to. And, Biden failed to do that. So I think Pete Buttigieg seemed to have done a good job for the most part as transportation secretary. I'm sure that there were scandals, and we'll get into some of that type of stuff later. But for the most part, back to my point, if you're wondering why people who are further left of center find Pete Buttigieg distasteful, it's because he's a product of a system that has kind of robbed us all while smiling in our faces. So I wasn't quite planning to intro him so glowingly there, but let's play this clip of him communicating to Andrew Schulz and talking to them about taxes, and they get into a little bit of stuff about tariffs. This is kind of a longer clip just so you can get the idea of this conversation, and then we'll bounce to some other things from there.
That's okay. But I don't want to lose the first thing you asked about, which is taxation, because I think, a big thing, I think most Americans, definitely my party, but I think most Americans believe that if you're making $1 billion, good for you. But you should at least be paying an effective tax rate that's comparable, or I would argue more than a firefighter. And that's not true right now.
Because nobody really makes $1 billion.
Right, because it's all equity, and it's you're not getting a paycheck.
Nobody makes income. Anybody that's generating that type of wealth is not making income.
Right.
So it's almost and this is not a woo-hoo, we got it so tough, but it's almost like the people who are, I think Miles used the term not middle rich, middle class, they're the ones that are actually paying what they should pay.
More or less.
If they're adhering to the tax code, they're not hiring these tax attorneys that are gonna attack it all willingly and try to reduce whatever they're paying in. But let's take it for face value, right? An athlete or somebody that's making $5 million, and let's say that they pay $2.5 million around, right? The concern I have really is potentially the corporations. And I'm not smart enough to even know about this stuff, but it seems to me, and I think tariffs plays into this, so I'd love to get your take on it. But it seems to me on the surface, and again, I'm giving a very emotional argument. You can give me tons of data, call me an idiot for even thinking this, but it's possible.
I doubt it, but
okay. Seems to me that there's been an effort that has been supported to, send the manufacturing of some of these products overseas to increase profits, right?
Sure.
Or maybe it's more effective to manufacture them overseas. Maybe it's not all nefarious, but the idea is to increase shareholder profits or increase the profits of the company, which I'm not necessarily against. What I'm against is when you also put these shell companies overseas to decrease, you create the headquarters and you put it in Dublin or something like that, so you can avoid taxes. So,
and it's a PO box, nobody's even there.
Exactly. So you can't do both. You can send the manufacturing overseas, but at least if we're taxing the revenue of that company that's generating billions of dollars, you would like to believe that money would come back to the American people, and then we could reinvest in the American people, and then maybe there's other industries that would pop up, and those jobs could transfer from manufacturing to those new ones.
Or vice versa.
Vice versa. But you can't do, to me, it just feels like if you do both, you are using the marketplace that America is, that really
entrepreneurship, all of that, but not really giving back,
and then stealing from it.
Yeah, there's no question, especially because a lot of what that tax revenue goes into, or is supposed to go into here in the US, is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So, but have you ever noticed, like, in like talks, or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like, I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
That thing would suck.
That is like all of the design, the manufacturing, supply chains. That's the kind of thing that corporations can do very well.
Yeah.
And Apple did it very well, and their competitors. But what makes the iPhone work? Well, among other things, the internet. The internet was literally invented by a federal research project. And it would never have been possible to invent the internet with a private company, because you wouldn't have got the kind of capital return, even though it's $1 trillion idea or a multi-trillion-dollar idea. You know, companies can do multi-billion-dollar ideas, but $1 trillion idea, like inventing the internet, that requires basic research. And that's the kind of thing the government's supposed to do, among many other things.
It requires basic research? What does that mean?
Yeah, by basic research, I mean things that are so fundamental that you actually don't know for 50 or 100 years if they're going to have a return. They might never work out.
Oh, right? Yeah. You can't look at it as this thing is going to be profitable. It has to be
So it's different
benevolent
from
endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting that there's going to
have a return in the next 10, 20 years.
Right, at least kind of within the kind of profit horizon.
Yeah, but public parks is another version of this and stuff like that. You can't privatize the public park.
Right. This is the whole idea of public goods, right? This is why we have governments, why we collect taxes.
God, we're turning into such libs already, dude.
Yeah, so a lot of interesting things getting said there. Andrew Schulz saying that if you are making billions of dollars, then that is, you're not earning that money. And you can put it in terms of like you have it in equity and whatever. What they're kind of right on the edge of saying is that like if you're making that much money, it's through some form of exploitation. You're exploiting some loop in the system, some loophole. You're exploiting government funds. You've found incredibly innovative ways to exploit a large workforce. And so, I mean, it's interesting for him even to reference that. And what I notice from these comedian guys is they want to be able to address this issue of economic inequality. And they see the dissatisfaction, and they ascribe, the second election of Trump to the dissatisfaction that people have with the status quo and the economy. That's probably an apt assessment, although I don't know if that's really economics is always the fundamental dynamic in a sense, but I think when it comes to Trump, there's just other things going on there. However, it's accurate that people's awareness of how the system works is what matters more than whether individuals are finding themselves with opportunities, or it's a weird economy where some people are destitute completely, and most of us are in some weird kind of in-between space where we're finding ways to get by. But when you really look at your life and you really look around you, you realize that you don't have most of the things that you should have available to you to lead like a stable life. And you're kind of just doing what you can in the in-between. And that's not really how the economy's supposed to work. And so the question is like, who is going to tie together a unifying message about those conditions that is going to actually lead to real change through whatever means, whether it means taking over the government electorally with one party or another, or whether it means, some kind of like larger revolutionization of the government. Whatever it is, those conditions need to be addressed by somebody. And it is true that Trump found some kind of way to address those issues. I don't think he's ever done anything other than just reference them in a way that people seem to find sincere. Donald Trump is certainly not providing any like thoughtful ideas of how we can live a better life, but he sounds decisive, and so people like that about him. And what a lot of the comedian types and people who want to play populist, but they don't want to consider themselves to the left, they don't want to have to start cutting into their own profits in order to create a more equitable version of their own business, but rather they want to talk about companies offshoring labor and offshoring factories and that sort of thing. And yeah, that's a huge part of it. But I find it interesting that that's where they place the focus, because there's so many other factors to that. And like the stagnation of wages in America is one of the is the main factor that makes it so that we are currently living with like a lower standard of living than we should. Highly productive, incredibly productive country, but our wages and our lifestyles and our cash on hand is not catching up with the amount of productivity that we are all producing. So that's a huge problem. And you know, the leverage imbalance that comes with companies being able to offshore their businesses definitely is part of that. It helps them keep wages low in America. But I just don't think you can even talk about that issue without talking about the more fundamental issue that corporations have their way with the government. And they do all of these things. They keep wages low. They hire offshores. They do all kinds of shady shit in order to keep their businesses running and to keep their profits growing. And it's at all of our expense. And it comes down to the fact that government is kind of crippled in its ability to regulate these companies. And every time it seems like there's a little bit of consciousness growing about these things, it gets redirected to this idea that somebody like Trump needs to come in and cut all the regulations. And so freedom gets reappropriated by people like Trump, the Republican Party, conservatives in general, and neoliberals like Pete Buttigieg. Freedom becomes reappropriated to be companies' freedom, corporations' freedom to profit at the expense of the rest of society. And over and over again, this loop happens. And every single president of my lifetime has been guilty of this. I would say to the least extent from what I've seen would be Biden. But even then, I mean, always, like Biden, went back on his promises to scale back like offshore drilling, and he was signing off on oil pipelines. And so there was some regulation happening during that time. And now even the Trump administration, through RFK Jr., who I'm definitely going to talk about more soon. Don't worry, we're going to get into the autism stuff that he's been talking about. But now they want to phase out red dye 40. And so that sounds great. What does that mean? Phase it out? What that means is regulation. That means you're going to regulate out their ability to use that dye. You say, this is poison. The government says you're not allowed to use that anymore. The company says, oh, but we're losing all this money and we've been using it all this time. And these people who got cancer from it aren't even doing that bad. They're fine. And ultimately, the government wins unless they are sabotaged by corporate-backed Republicans and Democrats who come in and say, okay, all this stuff is done. All these cases, all these investigations are over. All these departments that are meant to do oversight on these companies are slashed. They're cut. And so that gets into something interesting that Buttigieg was talking about later. Not going to play the clip of this part, but he talks about, they're talking about Doge. And he says that, well, Doge would be a good thing, essentially, if they ran it in a sensible way. And if they found a way to analyze these companies, identify the top performers and the lowest performers, and like make tough decisions, make tough cuts, make government more efficient that way. And they're talking about it from the perspective of Pete Buttigieg as a part of McKinsey, which was a consulting firm. This is the firm through which Buttigieg was accused of being involved in fixing bread prices in Canada. This was during the campaign. They said, oh, Pete Buttigieg was fixing prices, because that's what this consulting firm did. They would come in, find ways that you could maximize your profits, or they would also work with the private sector and find ways that you could make things more efficient. So, essentially what Doge fancied themselves to be, that's what Pete Buttigieg already did. And being involved with that type of work is why he ultimately got accused of being a bread price fixer in Canada. A large scheme, huge scheme to fix the prices of bread across Canada. And again, they denied that there was any involvement. There wasn't like a direct tie, but the company that Buttigieg worked with seemed to be involved in that scheme. And so, you know, that's the kind of background of the front runners for the Democratic Party. And, you know, when it comes to the private sector and maximizing your profits and working with a bunch of, you know, hoity-toity rich guys who are trying to make tough cuts and whatever, increase profits for shareholders, guys like Pete Buttigieg are very useful. Whether or not he's useful to us as a public servant, I don't know. I mean, I think he's useful as a communicator, and he seems to do well in less TV conditions, you know, like actually just putting his head down. It was always an odd decision for him to be part of the Department of Transportation, but it's possible that it's because that is where he thrives better, is less in the spotlight, even though he seems to like to be in the spotlight. So I don't know. I find him a little annoying, even though he does an excellent job communicating here. But there are some moments where I'm just like, yeah, like this is why you're part of the problem. And somebody like Andrew Schulz isn't really equipped politically to ask those type of questions and to get into the stuff about consulting and whether or not that type of participation and optimizing of capitalist systems is also part of what has made our society so unequal over all this time. And, you know, I think the fact that the Democratic Party can't imagine up better candidates than people like Pete Buttigieg, who are products of and progenitors of that system, I think is part of the problem. So it's great that he can communicate like a slightly more liberal style of, you know, thinking to these guys that can bring them back down to earth a little bit and get them out of this like weird manosphere type of talk. But at the same time, it's like, I really hope that his rhetoric doesn't become what the entire political conversation circulates around, because we do need more talk about oligarchy and about how the only way to fight oligarchy is to like fundamentally restructure society's relationship to wealth building and profit building. And so those are the type of conversations we have to have. We have to create something more sustainable than where we're at. And so, you know, good on Pete Buttigieg for, you know, going into different places and talking to people and spreading the message in a clear and concise way. And I guess we'll just have to find some way to radicalize them. Look at all these trains that capitalism is crashing, all these beautiful trains being blown up by capitalism. What are you going to do about it, Pete? If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you really want to support, consider becoming a member. It's the best way to support this channel. I'm posting all kinds of exclusive content there, like podcasts that don't make it to the main page, podcasts about more general things, book reviews, movie reviews, different stuff like that. I'm also dropping music early on there. I got an EP coming out called Dead Internet Theory. That's going to be out in the next week or so. You can hear that early as a member. Also, all the beats, if you like the beats in this podcast, all of that are posted there and more. If there's other stuff you'd like to hear as exclusive content, let me know and we'll work some things out.